Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is TURAN Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners! Today I would like to invite you to a fascinating dive into Central Asia's history, and in particular, the history of late 19th and early 20th century Uzbekistan, and a movement which played an important role in shaping education, culture, and art in the Russian Turkestan and then Soviet Central Asia. Jadids, the Muslim reformers and progressivists, left behind a wide array of works of literature and poetry, invested in education, and importantly, published a number of newspapers and periodicals where they set out their ideas of solving social problems. If not for the Stalinist purges, in which virtually all members of Central Asian intelligentsia lost their lives, the region today might have been a different place. The works of Jadidi writers and poets, including Cholpon, Abdurrauf Fitrat, and Abdullah Qadiri, were banned until the collapse of the Soviet Union. They were all rehabilitated in independent Uzbekistan, but they began to be widely commemorated and spoken about only in the past few years. Last year, a large multimedia exhibition about the movement called Jadids, Letters to Turkestan, was opened in the Tashkent City Mall, the biggest shopping center in Uzbekistan's capital. Obviously, I have not seen it because I'm still banned from Uzbekistan, so I won't tell you what it looked like and whether it was any good. From the description, I know that the exhibition told the story of students from Turkestan who were sent to Germany to study, and that it was visited by Saida Mirziyoyeva, the assistant to the president of Uzbekistan, and his older daughter. However, while over the past few years, Jadids have been back on the agenda of Uzbekistan's official narrative, we can't forget that they had inspired generations of Uzbek writers, activists, and oppositionists before it was cool. For those of you interested in this period of Uzbekistan's history, I really encourage you to read The Bygone Days, a 1925 novel by the Uzbek writer Abdullah Qadiri, translated into English a few years back by Mark Rees. And of course, you should also read one of my favorite Central Asia-themed books, The Devil's Dance, by the great Hamid Ismailov, which tells a fictionalized account of the last days of Abdullah Qadiri's life, mixed with a parallel story set in the 19th century Turkestan. Now, I'm very happy to invite you to an interview with the absolute guru of Jadidi research, Adeeb Khalid, who will help you feel the atmosphere of that time in history. Welcome to TURAN Talks. Hello everyone. Today I'm joined by Adeeb Khalid, who is a professor of history at Carleton College in the United States and the author of many academic articles and books about Central Asia and Islam in Central Asia, including The Politics of Muslim Cultural Reform, Jadidism in Central Asia. Hello, Adeeb.
Hello, Agnieszka.
Thank you so much for joining me today. You are one of the best experts probably out there in Jadidism in Central Asia, or in general in Jadidism. So you are perfect to for this episode, because my listeners have just listened to like a very short introduction into what Jadidism is and its current influence in Uzbekistan. But I would like to go back to the roots of the very movement. And I would like to start by asking you, what was the cultural and political and social environment on the territory of today's Uzbekistan, which was then part of the Russian Empire, towards the end of the 19th century, when the Jadid movement was born?
Well, so what is now Uzbekistan? Uzbekistan itself became an entity only in 1924. So what is now Uzbekistan was conquered by the Russian Empire in a series of conquests between the middle of the 1850s all the way down to the 1880s. So at the end of the 19th century, the Russian conquest was quite recent. Before that, the territory of Central Asia had been part of the broader Islamic world for many, many centuries. But I think there's a big debate about how isolated Central Asia was. It was connected with trade to its neighbors, both to the north and the south. But generally speaking, the technical advances had not really arrived, and which was one of the reasons why the Russians were able to conquer the existing states of Central Asia with rather little loss of life and quite easily. With the arrival of the Russian Empire, things changed. The economy of the region was transformed. One of the bigger things was the introduction of cotton as a cash crop that started in the 1880s. But also, sort of the orientation of Central Asia's economy shifted. The trade with India to the south became less important as Central Asia was incorporated into the Russian imperial economy. And that set in motion all kinds of social changes, especially in the cities, where sort of new groups of people began to emerge. They were tied to the new cotton economy. And for some of them, the question arose of what had just happened. Why were we conquered? What is to be done about that? And it is out of this intellectual ferment that Jadidism was born at the turn of the 20th century. On the one hand, it had its local Central Asian specificities, that it was the answer that mostly urban intellectuals, some of them began to ask about what had happened, why had we been conquered. On the other hand, it was part of a much broader phenomenon that ranged across the Muslim world, where, again, by the end of the 19th century, there were basically 2 Muslim states left that had any degree of sovereignty. Well, 3. The Ottoman Empire, Iran, and Morocco at the turn of in the year 1900. And so there was very much a sense of decline, of weakness, of being left behind. And so across the Muslim world, intellectuals were seeking answers to A, why had we become so political weak, and B, what is to be done? And how is our Islamic heritage going to work with this modern age that has dawned upon us? So Jadidism was, in that sense, very much a part of this broader phenomenon as well.
So if we can say now, who were the Jadids and what kind of vision of society they developed? What kind of changes they wanted to see in their societies?
Right. Okay. So again, we'll talk about mostly the Jadids and what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, because again, in the north, among the Kazakhs, things were very different. So we'll just talk about contemporary Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Here, most of the people came from sort of urban educated classes. Many of them came from families of religious elites, and many of them had very solid, traditional, conventional Islamic educations. But some of them had traveled, and some of them were pondering all the new changes that were happening. And so it's a movement among urban elites. Some of them were not very rich. They had much greater cultural capital than financial capital, if you will. There are very few people from among the really rich families that became rich through trade. What they wanted to do was most basically to survive as a community in the modern world, in the new conditions that had been created by imperial conquest. So a new kind of economy had emerged in Central Asia that required new kinds of skills. Anything from learning Russian to being able to navigate the new commercial possibilities. You have to have ultimately engineers and doctors from your own community. Otherwise, you will be completely marginalized. So this was the argument that we need to acquire these new kinds of skills. And then the big question was, for a lot of conservative elites argued that these new kinds of education do not conform with Islam. And so for the Jadids, as with Muslim modernists everywhere else in the Muslim world, the task was to argue that Islam and modern life are completely compatible. And this required then new ways of interpreting Islam and looking back at the region's own Islamic heritage with new eyes, and arguing that not only is Islam completely compatible with modern life and modernity, but actually Islam demands that people acquire these modern kinds of knowledge. So this was sort of a conundrum. And again, this is shared by Muslim modernists everywhere. In the Ottoman Empire, in India, in Egypt, you have similar kinds of intellectual movements that argue for the complete compatibility of Islam and modernity. So the Jadids were part of that.
And how they referred to the Muslim clergy, how they were seen by the official religious establishment.
So in some ways, there wasn't really an official religious establishment. The Russians did tolerate different kinds of religion, but there wasn't really a sort of an officially formulated Muslim religious elite in Central Asia. So here there was a contest between the Jadids, who they laid claim to leadership in society. They said, we have the answers that our society needs to survive in the modern age. A lot of the Jadids were also very young, in their 20s. If you're a 30-year-old, you're almost old for a Jadid by this time. And many of them had classical Islamic education, but others also had a foot in the other world, in the world of modern, often Russian education. So for the traditional, for the conservative religious scholars, these guys were just young upstarts who did not know anything about Islam, and what they were saying was all wrong. So there were serious tensions between the traditional, conventional, conservative religious scholars and the Jadids. And this was actually, I would say, the single most defining feature of the Jadid movement before 1917, before the Russian Revolution.
In what sense it was the most defining feature? You mean the generational gap or generational conflict?
So there was generational conflict as well, but ultimately it was a question of, who's right and what Islam is. So the conservative clergy said Islam is how we have always thought about it, which is rooted in conventional practices and sanctified by tradition. The Jadids said, no, actually, the Islam that we practice has been corrupted. We have incorporated into it all sorts of customs and traditions that are actually alien to Islam. So there was this element of actually purifying Islam by going back to the original sources and not all these centuries of tradition and interpretation. So yes, there was a generational element as well, but ultimately, what I meant by it being a defining feature was that Jadidism was as much defined against conservative elements in Central Asian society, as much more against them than against the Russians.
And in practice, what did it mean? I mean, what was the Jadids' position, for example, of on women's rights? Were they like liberal in today's terms, or were they, still pretty much conservative?
Okay, well, I think the women's question is a little bit of red herring, so I'll come to that in a moment. But I would say that in practice, Jadidism meant undertaking new kinds of practices, reading newspapers. Print was a major transformative figure, and but also new kinds of education. So the flagship of the Jadid reform was the New Method School, and it's actually from the New Method that the term Jadidism actually comes. That schooling should be of a completely different kind, where children should be given functional literacy and education and kinds of things that the traditional Islamic elementary schools did not have. It also meant new forms of sociability, that you need to, organize sort of benevolent societies to help society. That the wealthy members of society need to help look out for the benefit of society as a whole. And it meant new kinds of cultural production, so writing short stories and novels and staging theatrical plays. This is what Jadidism meant in practice. On the question of women, yes, I think I would say that their vision of gender norms was not particularly radical, nor was the case with any other reform movements anywhere else in the world. By judging them by today's standards, we'll always find them completely lacking. But what they did argue was that women need to be educated because they need to be good mothers for the community. And this is sort of, again, a very common sort of national vision of women's rights that is driven ultimately not by a serious critique of existing gender norms, but by the good of the nation. And again, you have that all over Europe and the United States as well in the 19th century, that that we need to change women's position in society for the good of the republic or the good of the nation.
And what was the Jadid's lifestyle? If we can think about, like a typical day, what would it look like?
I think there is a range here again. And we are basically talking before 1917, because I think the Russian Revolution transformed all sorts of things, including Jadidism itself.
We'll get to that.
Yeah, we'll get to that. Before 1917, I think there's already, in some ways, we are talking sort of at a fairly micro level, but there was already some sort of a generational shift. So there are some of the older Jadids and those who came of age in the 1910s. Some of them had more Russian education. So I think in terms of how you dress, how you comport yourself, and what is your idea of the right forms of sociability, that was shifting towards more sort of European, Russian, or in some ways Ottoman, Turkish patterns. That was the vision of what being modern meant for the younger groups. For some of the older men, there was, I think you could make an argument for new kinds of education and for education for women without necessarily changing, the way you dress and the way you comport yourself. If that answers your question a little bit.
Yes, it does, but I'm still going to push you a little bit more because when I imagine this time, obviously I might be completely wrong and biased, but what I see is chai hanas, is people, spending time together in this like community life. Has anything new, what was anything new created at that time? Like any new places where people would hang out together, or any new forms of, leisure? Maybe there is something, maybe there isn't.
So, I mean, there were new forms of sociability that you should create these benevolent philanthropic organizations that should then create libraries and reading rooms for the good of the community, and new kinds of schools. I think schooling, again, is the central feature here. So two things now, that ultimately in 1917, Jadidism in Central Asia was still a fairly new phenomenon. And on the one hand, in the cities of Central Asia, its presence was very much there. But it's also very easy to exaggerate how widespread it was. And I think there is a little bit of a tendency today, especially in Uzbekistan, looking back and seeing in Jadidism a more robust and numerous phenomenon than was indeed the case.
Mm-hmm. So what was the real influence of the new schools and the new thinking on society?
So it was, again, we don't need to exaggerate it very much, but what I would say is that by 1917, there was a niche in society for these modern ideas, but there was still already always a substantial amount of suspicion and pushback against them as well. And that comes out in the democratic politics of 1917 that we can come to. But I would say in when the revolution broke out, Central Asian urban society was different from what it was in 1865 in many radical ways. And Jadidism was part of that difference.
And before we get to the revolution, which is obviously a very important part of this story, maybe we can say how strong the anti-colonial sentiment was within the Jadidi movement.
Okay, so 1917 brings a big change, or actually really 1918. Before that, again, it's very tempting to read more into Jadidism before 1917 than was actually the case. So I think before 1917, the Jadid's discourse was aimed directly at their own society. That there were no political possibilities, no possibilities of political action aimed at the Russian state. So the society was colonized, it had lost its sovereignty, so it had to act together to pull itself up by its bootstraps. And the Jadid's mission was to show, and this comes up over and over again in their writings, to show the mirror to society itself. And so that meant that critique of the Russians and what today we'd call anti-colonialism was perhaps a very basic subtext, but it was not really argued out very much. So one of the key features of Jadid rhetoric before 1917 was, to show the mirror to society and to present examples of how things ought to be done. And here, for them, the Russians and Europeans in general, and to a great extent, the Ottoman Empire, were models to be emulated rather than the subject of massive critique. Because the Russians and the Europeans had used knowledge and education to strengthen themselves. That changed after 1917 quite substantially, but you don't really see a very clearly articulated anti-colonial sentiment before 1917. It was anti-colonial only in the sense that we need to strengthen ourselves to better our condition.
So let's get to this magical 1917. And what was the situation in the region at the time? And was the Bolshevik Revolution a surprise to the local populations?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, first of all, I think the Russian Revolution and the Bolsheviks are not identical. The revolution happened in February. And at that time, even in Petrograd, in the capital of the Russian Empire, the Bolsheviks were nowhere on the scene. So in February, if someone had said that in 8 months, the country would be in the hands, or the empire would be in the hands of the Bolsheviks, people would have thought you were crazy. So I think this is something we need to keep in mind. The abdication of the Tsar was seen by everyone as the dawn of a new era when Russia would be free and its peoples, its many different nationalities would be able to renegotiate some sort of a new order. So for the Jadids, the fall of the abdication of the Tsar, the creation of the Russian Republic in the spring of 1917 was the time to jump into action and to try to put their desires, their hopes for change into action. And there was the provisional government declared all subjects of the Tsar to be equal citizens with equal voting rights. And over the course of the spring and the summer of 1917, there were all sorts of elections. So two things happened that sort of dented the Jadids' hopes for rapid change that they would control. One was that opposition from within their own society proved to be very strong. So you have one person, one vote, including women voting. And here the Jadids often found that their conservative opponents, whether they were religious scholars or merchants and businessmen who did not agree with their vision of reform, kept beating them in elections. The other thing was that the Russian population, which in the cities in Turkestan was substantial, Tashkent was maybe 1/3 Russian. Even though in Central Asia as a whole, the Russian settlers amounted to less than 5%. So in the cities, the Russians organized on their own on the assumption that the natives will stay in their place. And eventually in October, it was the Russians in Central Asia that took power in the name of the Soviets. So the Russian Revolution in Central Asia became a revolution of the Russians. So the Jadids were marginalized both by opposition in their own society and by these Russians who just took power. And so in that sense, yes, the second revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, was a big surprise. But then in the politics of the next few years are very, very complicated. So for the Jadids, the struggle was as much with their conservative enemies in their own society as with the Bolsheviks. And at the same time, the broader global situation also changed. That the Ottoman Empire was defeated in 1918, and it was basically occupied by the British and the French, right? And so for that for the Jadids was a pretty traumatic moment, that the last Muslim sovereign state in the world is gone. What is to be done? And here, the promise of the revolution seemed to them to be something that could be the answer. So before 1917, they had basically argued in terms of let's learn from the Europeans. And now in 1918, many of the Jadids turned to a pretty sharp anti-colonial critique of European powers. And here they saw an ally in the new Soviet regime that was also anti-imperial. And so, therefore, 1917 and more like 1918 is a moment when the Jadids turned to anti-colonialism as a major idea, but also that the horizons of what they wanted to achieve also broaden. And this is a moment of radicalization, especially of cultural radicalization for the Jadids.
So what exactly happened? So how they got radicalized?
Well, I mean, the vision, the idea that, okay, on the one hand, that there is so much opposition from their own society, that the conservative religious elites just push back against and declare that these young people know nothing about it and they have no business, arguing for all the things that they were arguing for. So that was a moment of radicalization, that this idea of just trying to convince our society is not going to work. We need some stronger measures and perhaps the use of revolutionary state authority to work on our behalf, to push back against our conservative enemies. And so in 1918 and 1919, many of the Jadids sort of entered institutions of Soviet power to try to work with the revolutionary authority to push back against opposition in their own society. But also a sense that, the cultural radicalization was that all the things we had sort of talked about before 1917 are not really enough. We need to go farther. We need to have more radical transformation in our culture, more massive school construction, but also the transformation of language and literature, and a more radical critique of Islamic conservatism. So that's the radicalization that I see.
And how the cooperation between the new authorities and the Jadids was developing?
It was very, very complicated. And this is actually something I'm writing on right now. And so the Jadids had certain hopes that the new order would be friendly to them. And so for 3 years, Central Asia was largely cut off from Russia. During the Russian Civil War, the trains ran only briefly, and anti-Bolshevik forces had occupied large parts of the territory. So in that period, all sorts of Jadids acted, sort of joined or tried to join Soviet institutions. Then by 1920, the center consolidated its control back on Central Asia, and then sort of what used to be called party discipline, that the Bolshevik party should, its members should have be ideologically reliable and be subject to the discipline of the party. That came in and that pushed many of the Jadids out of the party. But the Soviets did have a program of, they call it cultural construction, and of creating new forms of mobilization and education that had many overlaps with what the Jadids had hoped. So it's here, again, I'm little wary of this idea of cooperation between the Jadids and the Soviets. There is a narrative out there that all the Jadids became communists, and that that's very problematic. What you have is a new cohorts of people becoming active in public life that share many ideas in common with the Jadids, but they are really ultimately members of the local society who are joining the communist parties. And many of them had no prior experience with Jadidism. So it's this new group of sort of Central Asian communists that come to occupy a significant position in the party structures of Central Asia. The leadership remained European. And I say European because they're Russians, but they're also Ashkenazi Jews and Ukrainians and Latvians and Poles in the party leadership. And the leadership remained suspicious of these native communists. They needed them, but they're also, always a little bit suspicious that they are. The most common accusation was that they are nationalists, meaning that they actually think about the concerns of their own society. And the 1920s was this period of some sort of uneasy coexistence. And then in the 1930s, party discipline meant the expulsion of lots of local communists. And then the purges of the late 1930s actually killed off all sorts of Jadids as well as Muslim communists, and put in its place a new generation of Central Asian communists who were much more solidly a product of the Soviet period. So 1938 is another turning point of when the old elites are really completely expelled or executed in many ways, in many cases. And so that's a whole different generation that comes after that.
I would like to make a step back and just ask you how the Jadids positioned themselves vis-a-vis Alash Orda, for example. So the short-lived para-state in Kazakhstan, which also had this anti-colonial, anti-Russian sentiment and could be compared to the Jadid movement in some ways.
Absolutely, and there were parallels between them. And after 1917, there were actually quite a bit of overlap as well. There was an autonomous Republic of Turkestan that was proclaimed in Kokand in response to the Soviet takeover of power. And there were a number of people who were members of both Alash Orda and this autonomous government of Turkestan. Ultimately, however, Alash Orda comes out of a somewhat different context. For the Kazakhs, the big question was that had consolidated the Alash identity was the question of Russian settlement and the loss of land, that Russian settlers kept taking over Kazakh land. And so that had given the Kazakh leadership a much more critical stance towards the Russian Empire than was the case with the Jadids in the south. Second, that the Kazakh elites had been educated in Russian schools for a lot longer. since the 1840s. And so the Kazakh leadership of the Alashorda had a somewhat different political orientation. They were much more comfortable in Russian and much more connected to uh, other Russian parties. So that's sort of a distinction I would draw, that rather than lump all of the Jadids and the Alashorda together. But ultimately, yes, they were these two parallel movements that both claimed autonomy in 1917 and 1918.
So before we get to the purges, maybe we can talk a little bit about the role of literature and poetry in the Jadid movement, especially after the revolution. Has it changed anyhow, and what sort of impact it had on the culture?
Oh, so that was one of the biggest transformations that for the Jadids, the revolution was the summons to action, and that meant opening new schools, but also staging ever more plays. The theater season in Tashkent in 1919 and 1920, at the height of the Civil War, was very vibrant. And new kinds of writing and new kinds of literature emerged. And the 1920s, I would say, is very much a sort of a golden age where people are experimenting with new forms of expression, transforming the language itself. And here there is, it's largely a flourishing of pre-revolutionary sort of impulses that have nothing to do with the Soviets or the Bolsheviks. But the Soviet state did have this claim for it, that it also supported education and new forms of thinking. It provided resources. So publishing, so newspapers that had always struggled to survive in purely market conditions before 1917 now could be established. Better printing presses, so on and so forth. But there was always this tension between sort of what the Soviets thought was the proper revolutionary forms of expression and what the Jadids thought. Up until 1927, there was, the Soviet authorities, meaning these Europeans that served at the head of the party, had so little expertise of local languages that they could not really control the press all that well. And so in that moment, in that space of incomplete central control, you have massive kinds of new forms of expression that develop. And then from the late 1920s, the ideological controls become stricter. In 1932, the Writers' Union was established and all writers had to join it. And that transformed things quite substantially. So the press of the 1920s is absolutely fascinating to read. It's all in flux, all sorts of new ideas that are, unorthodox from a Soviet point of view are expressed. By the 1930s, you just have this tightly controlled, highly ideological forms of expression with very little of the flair of the 1920s. The difference between the two decades is just very, very stark.
So if we can kind of start to wrap it up, so what happened to the Jadids in the 1930s?
Well, they were pushed out of public life beginning as early as 1927. They were considered to be, not ideologically reliable. They now began to be called bourgeois nationalists and agents of the national bourgeoisie, etc., 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 which is a kind of accusation that was leveled against many other national intelligentsias in the Soviet Union beginning in the late 1920s. So they were pushed out. Some of them could not publish, or they took up work such as translations just to make a living. And then in 1937, there were large numbers of arrests, and basically in October of 1938, hundreds of sort of Uzbek intellectuals who were both Jadids but also early Uzbek communists, a lot of them were actually executed and, tossed into mass graves, so we don't even know where they're buried.
And what happened afterwards? What happened? What happened with their legacy during the Soviet years?
So basically, under Khrushchev in the after his secret speech, the process of rehabilitation began, and that was a legal process in which people who had been accused of anti-Soviet crimes, their families could appeal those verdicts, and those verdicts could then be annulled, and those people could be rehabilitated. So the legal process proceeded. In terms of the legacy, that was a different matter. So a lot of people were legally rehabilitated, both politicians and intellectuals. Some of them were then rehabilitated also in the sense that most of their works could be published, could be brought back into print. Most, but not all, because even with those who were rehabilitated, the works they were writing in the early 20s were just too difficult to explain away in the Soviet context. And then for some of the biggest figures, and here I'm talking about Abdul Hamid Cholpan, the great poet, who had really reinvented Uzbek poetry in the 1920s, and Abdur Rauf Fitrat, who was maybe one of the most prolific scholars, a polymath who wrote history and novels and plays. These two figures basically could barely be mentioned. So histories of modern Uzbek literature would have a passing reference to them as bourgeois nationalists or something like that. And it was really only during Glasnost under Gorbachev in 1988 or so, late into Glasnost, that their works began to be put back into print.
And what's the situation now? Because Jadids are, again, in fashion in Uzbekistan. There are exhibitions organized in memory of Jadids. Like, how do you see this change, and how do you see this legacy?
So as a scholar of Jadidism, I'm delighted that they are, they're becoming household names again in Uzbekistan. But as a historian of that period, I'm also a little bit skeptical about how their memory is being transformed. So yes, there are lots of exhibitions, conferences, publications. I would say that there are two issues there that I have some qualms about. One is that there is some sort of an exaggerated sense of how numerous and how significant in their society they were. And there is an exaggeration of just how coherent a political program they had. Because ultimately, as I was saying, that before 1917, it was still a fledgling intellectual movement whose members had not tackled all the questions. So there is that sense of, exaggeration of their place that also goes with an unhappiness in talking about the kinds of opposition they faced from within their own society. And that in contemporary Uzbek writings about the Jadids, that opposition is just not there very much. The second problem is, again, this question of a definition. I think, as I was saying, the revolution of 1917, 1918 were a big turning point for the Jadids, and their thinking became ever more radicalized, and many of them saw in the Soviets a form of support for their anti-colonial vision. And today in Uzbekistan, sometimes all of Jadidism tends to be homogenized into some single thing without this massive turning point of the revolution. And ultimately also a definitional thing that the term is expanded so much that, people I would classify as Muslim communists who joined public life after 1917 without any prior connection to Jadid activities are also labeled Jadids, as is Ala Shorda. So I think once you expand the definition of Jadidism that broadly, I think it doesn't really serve very good analytical purposes.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting, and good luck with all your work and all your research. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
That's it for today. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to TURAN Tales on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media.